So I guess most people in the room here are probably very familiar with Grab, but just in case some people aren't, could you start by briefly introducing yourself and the company?
Sure. First of all, I wanted to apologize for running a little bit late. 実は日本に12年間に住んでいたけど my Japanese has gotten much worse ever since leaving, so I apologize for that. But I've always felt that Tokyo is home, for me. So thank you again for inviting me over. So perhaps maybe I'll start with the founding story of Grab as a start. Grab was founded by our two co-founders, Anthony Tan and Wei-Ling Tan. And they met each other at Harvard Business School, HBS, in a class called Business at the Base of the Pyramid, or BBOP. And the goal of BBOP was always about how do you create economic opportunities for the lower half of the population pyramid. So those that are much less well off than I suspect many of us here in Tokyo today. And the key case study at HBS that really triggered Grab was a business called Lapdesk. And the business of Lapdesk was about how do you provide very basic educational equipment to children in Africa. And so, in Africa, many children don't even have desks to use in school. And so they came up with this business model in Bebop where they would have these flat desks, but then they would monetize by selling advertisements on top of the desk. And that was the start of the case study at Bebop, which was about how do you create business that can be socially responsible at the same time. I think many of us are familiar with maybe the model where someone becomes very successful, and then after they become very successful, then they start giving back to their communities, giving back to society. But Bebop was always about how do you create social good at the same time as creating a viable, sustainable business. And so Grab was founded as a for-profit social enterprise. For-profit in the sense of, the real mission for Grab was around creating economic empowerment for what we call everyday entrepreneurs, who are individuals at the bottom half of the pyramid. And what we realized is, when you look at that population pyramid, the bottom half of the pyramid are populated by individuals who are truly entrepreneurs in their own right. They're everyday entrepreneurs. They may be a taxi driver, they may own a small, medium enterprise, they may be a construction worker, but they're all entrepreneurs trying to earn a living for themselves. And many of them, particularly in Southeast Asia, was really in the informal economy, meaning they're not paying taxes, they're not getting healthcare, they don't have insurance. They were living paycheck to paycheck, or many times, day by day, hand to hand. And so what we realized, what Ling and Anthony realized is, there's this old saying, it's always better to teach someone how to fish than to give them fish, because then you teach them how to create their own livelihoods. And what's the modern fishing rod? Well, it's the smartphone. The smartphone is the most amazing fishing rod possible. It creates opportunities for everyday entrepreneurs around the world. And so we started a business to help these everyday entrepreneurs move from the informal economy to the formal economy, initially with a ride-sharing service on demand, where now these everyday entrepreneurs could be their own boss. They could be their own individuals, earn incomes, and really transition from the informal economy to now the formal economy, where now they're paying taxes, they have access to insurance products, they have access to credit products, and really creating livelihoods, not just for themselves, but for their families. And so that was the start of Grab, nearly now, I think maybe 11 years ago, for the business.
Right, and now you guys are obviously a super app. I think maybe people in Japan aren't very familiar with that term because the markets and the dynamics are a little bit different. So could you briefly describe what exactly is a super app?
Sure, it's a great question. And I think arguably Japan is the real inventor of the super app. We all remember iMode. I remember iMode, using iMode and the different services that were available. And then you saw similar models in China with WeChat and so forth. And I think the idea of a super app at least in the West, is often associated with how do you maximize the LTV while minimizing CAC? So how do you maximize the lifetime value of a customer? How do you minimize the cost of acquisition and effectively cross-sell the same customer base on multiple services, over time? And I think that's absolutely true for many super apps. But for us, the super app was never about trying to maximize LTV or CACs or three-letter acronyms or financial metrics, et cetera. For us, the idea of a super app was really predicated on just going back to our mission, right? And our mission was about creating economic empowerment for everyday entrepreneurs. And so we started that in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, by giving these everyday entrepreneurs access to a ride-sharing economy. But we realized, there's lots of times when our entrepreneurs aren't running a ride. And so are there opportunities to give our everyday entrepreneurs other ways to earn incomes when they're not doing ride sharing? That's how we thought about, what about food delivery? And if you look at we all probably use ride sharing maybe, 2 or 3 times a day to work, from work, maybe to meetings. But during the rest of the day, we're not really using ride sharing. And so during those times, our drivers aren't earning incomes. But food delivery, on the other hand, we all eat 3, 4, I probably eat 5 times a day. We're always ordering food delivery. And so it became a very natural extension of the original ride-sharing business to extend into other opportunities to generate incomes for our drivers. So that's what predicated our launch into food delivery. It ultimately became what drove our launch into grocery deliveries. And ultimately, when you think about the financial services aspect of Grab, today we operate one of the largest digital wallets across Southeast Asia. Not only are we doing payments, but we're doing lending, we're doing insurance services. And the way we really thought about that was, again, it's a extension of our mission of creating economic empowerment. Because once you provide an individual with the smartphone, with an opportunity to create incomes and sustainable livelihoods, then what they really also need is access to credit. The small warung or the small shop owner, to really grow their business, not just from 1 store, but to 2 stores, to 3 stores, they need access to credit. Many of our drivers need access to insurance, to accident insurance, health insurance. And so financial services to us was another aspect of creating economic empowerment for our everyday entrepreneurs, in addition to just generating incomes for them. So for us, the super app strategy was never about 3-letter acronyms. It was about extending our mission and executing on our mission in the best way possible.
Right. So maybe taking a little bit of a step back. So you started out in private equity. You've been doing that for 12 plus years. And at that time, I guess, even SoftBank was quite active in the ride hailing kind of app space in terms of investment. So, there were players like, I guess now Didi in China, OlaCabs in India, and then Grab, of course. But was there anything in particular, I guess, at the early stages when you were working as an investor there that made Grab stand out, or that kind of had a ding factor that other companies didn't, that attracted you to ultimately join?
Yeah, it was really interesting because you're right. At SoftBank, I was in a very privileged position to see many of the ride-sharing and on-demand economy companies really around the world, and had a firsthand look at what was happening in India and China, Southeast Asia. And when we made the investment into Grab, I remember thinking, gosh, if you really compare Southeast Asia to India or China, it's probably the smallest market. Probably the smallest TAM. It's the least impressive of all of these, large market opportunities. But what really resonated with me personally was 2 things. One was our co-founder Anthony. If you get to know Anthony, he's a very faithful person. He has very strong convictions around boundaries, about what lines not to cross. And he is as aggressive an entrepreneur as you'll find, anywhere. But there's a there's a very strong focus around doing business in a very honorable way. And so at Grab, one of our culture elements is our 4 H's, which includes heart, hunger, humility, and honor. And these 4 H's are how we think about doing business really across each of our countries. And I think that focus on that cultural importance was a very important point for me. The second point was, of all of the companies that I had an opportunity to work with, there was not, and there continues to be, no other company that is as mission driven and mission focused as Grab. Many companies have a mission statement or a tagline that's written by the marketing department or written by the CSR department, the corporate social responsibilities department, and it doesn't really resonate. It really doesn't really, it's not true to heart. But Grab was so unique because we truly believe that our mission in life is to create economic empowerment for just a large swath of the population across Southeast Asia. I mean, I remember, first joining, thinking part of the key of economic empowerment and really uplifting individuals from the informal economy to the formal economy was the realization that this is actually a very important stabilizing force, for Southeast Asia. And if we can lift these individuals into the formal economy, we create hope, we provide hope. And I think that mission, again, is such a embedded part of everybody at Grab, all the Grabbers. That's what really resonated with me.
And I feel like you guys have been able to kind of apply that concept into different regions, and also obviously expand services like very quickly, right? You briefly touched on, for example, starting off with transportation, going into payments, doing food delivery, parcel delivery. So like inside the head of Grab, what does that decision making look like when you're thinking about what do these everyday entrepreneurs need? How do you guys strategically decide, okay, like let's do this and not do this right now? Or
Yeah. Well, we stay very focused around understanding the customer and understanding what our everyday entrepreneurs really need. One of our key tenets is to be hyper local, and being hyper local means understanding that the restaurant owner in Singapore is probably very different from the hawker store owner down the street. Very different from the warung or the small shop owner in Jakarta. Very different from the owner in Bangkok and Philippines. And each of these owners, each of these everyday entrepreneurs have very different needs. And so we stay very close to our merchants, to our drivers, to our everyday entrepreneurs. We spend a lot of time with them understanding what they need, how to create economic empowerment in the right way that's sustainable. Because it's very easy for companies to create economics by just handing out promos. And that's the easiest thing to do in the world, just hand a promo. Again, you give the individual fish and they're happy for the day. Right. But much more important is how do you create the fishing rod, the modern fishing rod in the smartphone, and the right set of services that are truly helping the entrepreneurs feel like they have their destiny in their own hands. Now, if you take that philosophy then to Southeast Asia, what we realized was very quickly after we launched our ride-sharing service, we had the largest transportation fleet, on-demand transportation fleet across Southeast Asia. And so when you think about the services that make sense for an on-demand economy, and there's no question that the world is heading towards an on-demand economy, whether it's ride-sharing, whether it's food delivery, increasingly groceries. And over time, what we're seeing is more and more of e-commerce is also headed towards an on-demand, same-day or instant fulfillment opportunity. So that glide path helps us think about the set of services that we can offer to create economic opportunities, income opportunities for our entrepreneurs, and leverage that massive supply density that we created across 8 different countries in Southeast Asia.
So I think you guys have expanded, I think, 8 different countries now, and maybe 7 to 8 years, I believe. That's almost right, 1 country every year. Very impressive in terms of speed. But I wanted to double click on how you mentioned hyper-localization, because I think maybe that's one of the key factors that differentiated you guys from players like Uber or who are coming in from the West. But how have, maybe for people here, it's easier to visualize if there's like a service or a region where you found that done exceptionally well?
Sure, and we could talk about hyper-localization for hours and hours, and when we were first in the market in ride sharing, there was no question that Uber had a better product than ourselves. No question about it. Their engineering was fantastic. Their product was beautiful, very, very positive. But that forced us to focus on being hyper-local and differentiating in different ways. So for example, Uber used to deliver ice cream in Singapore to consumers. And as we thought about that, ice cream is nice for the Western audience in the United States. But what consumers in Singapore really love is something called a durian. It's called the king of fruits. It smells terrible, but it's absolutely delicious. And so we ended up delivering durian. And that's what creates heart share, amongst consumers. So that's a very simple example. Another example is, if you remember, the original ride-sharing services was a estimated payment upfront, but you only found the final payment at the end of the ride, and that depended on the route taken, the time, distance, etc. But when you look at the consumer in Southeast Asia, whether it's the auntie or the uncle, they need to have price certainty up front. They just won't accept that uncertainty around pricing. And so one of the very early things that we innovated on was upfront pricing. So as soon as you get into the car, how much you will pay, not at the end of the ride. And that's another great example. Another great example, in many of our cities, and this goes back now 7, 8 years, we knew that in many of our cities, the fastest way to get from point A to point B is not in a car. It's actually on a motorbike. It's faster, it's not stuck in traffic. It's by far the most efficient way to get around a city. And so while Uber was very focused around providing the best-in-class 4-wheel car experience, we quickly realized that we have to be very multimodal from day one. And so it's not just cars, because cars are only attracting or servicing the top end of the customer segment. But if you really want to make your service ubiquitous, then you have to provide other forms of transportation that's frankly much more familiar to the consumers in Southeast Asia. So rather than forcing consumers into a vehicle, into a 4-wheel car, let's adapt the service to what consumers are most familiar with. And so we launched motorbike delivery and on-demand ride sharing. In certain markets like Thailand, we operate tuk-tuks, these 3-wheel vehicles. So I always used to think, look, we operate 2 wheels, 3 wheels, 4 wheels. Multimodal was a key part of creating ubiquity and mind share and addressing by far the largest part of the customer demographic in Southeast Asia. Another example, as you know, when you order a car, it'll give you a little license plate so you can find the car and know that you're getting to the right vehicle. Well, imagine, many of you have been in Jakarta, and when you get out of a train station, what you'll see hundreds of motorbikes just clamped together, waiting to pick up a ride. Well, what happens? I mean, on a motorbike, the license plate is this big, and you can't find your driver. It's impossible. And so we innovated on a product that was called just tap and go, where rather than being pre-booked with a driver, you go up to a motorbike driver, you tap your phones together, and then you're instantly booked on the spot, without having for the consumer to have to search for that license plate, that tiny little license plate in a sea of motorcycles across the road. So all these little innovations, I think, was the key to being hyper-local and addressing and customizing the service for the specific environment that we operated in.
So you mentioned that Grab is very focused, obviously, on finding the pain points and providing what users and the everyday entrepreneur needs. I think maybe this number is pretty old now, but I believe it's like 75% plus users use more than 3 services on Grab. But when you guys are kind of testing out or trying to think about whether these services are working, especially when you're working in so many different regions, what are you guys kind of measuring and looking at internally?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we look at different metrics across, really across the board for different services. But I think a few thoughts. The first is we're always open to experimentation, and in fact, having a spirit of experimenting on different services and recognizing that many times some of these services won't work is an important part of just the mentality of opening up the platform to new ideas. And so if you look through the history of Grab, we've had many failures, frankly, on different services that hasn't really worked out. But we're very focused around engagement, around targeting customers that understand the service that we're offering, and can differentiate between different platforms. And there's a whole host of metrics and 3-letter acronyms I'm sure everybody in this crowd is familiar with, but it really is quite specific and tailored to the specific services that we track for each different application. What is very important on the back end, though, is to remember that every service has to add more to the whole than just the sum of the parts. And so whether it's increasing our supply density of vehicles or drivers, whether it's increasing the efficiency of the network, whether it's lowering the marginal cost of a ride or a marginal cost of a delivery, all of those platform metrics are ultimately what creates value that is much, much larger than just the sum of each of these parts separately.
Mm-hmm. I know, you obviously mentioned that Grab wasn't necessarily aiming to be, a super app, and it kind of naturally progressed as you guys were building out these services. But I'm assuming maybe there's like a point in time where the mindset shifts, where it's, not necessarily, okay, let's launch this feature and this function, but it's more about, okay, how can we grow this platform or this super app to service, these everyday entrepreneurs? Was there like a time where there was a shift in the organization and the thinking?
I actually think it's just a constant Kaizen, a constant evolution of the platform. And I think the main focus for us continues to be driven around where are the opportunities to create true differentiated value for our everyday entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And with that as your North Star, I think that then guides and helps us determine what services to offer, what not to offer, where to spend time to focus on, and how to really create value for both our consumers as well as our everyday entrepreneurs on our marketplace.
When you're thinking about like services, obviously there's a lot of localization and customization. Are most of the services really customized and geared to each region? Like, is there, for example, a service where you can kind of expand naturally without having to make those specific changes?
It's a very, very good question, and I think this speaks to our philosophy has been to create a single platform that is extensible and customizable for each and every country based on the unique characteristics. So, for example, when you look at the order of services, the services that we surface on our top row versus our second row, the order is different country by country, and that's all informed by our teams on the ground around how do we think about surfacing the right opportunities to our consumers in every market. We provide a number of ways, but again, it's a single platform, and then we allow our countries to really customize and localize to be relevant for the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I guess shifting gears a little bit here, obviously Japan is a very different market from Southeast Asia, but we do have super app-like players, right? Like Line, Rakuten, PayPay. Do you think there's a potential for kind of the super app landscape to grow here in Japan, or just curious what your thoughts are looking at Japan specifically?
Yeah, and I'm actually hoping to learn from everybody in this audience on really what works in Japan versus the rest of the world. For us, the super app strategy is about the mission and about how we hope to create a sustainable business for our everyday entrepreneurs. And I think what we've observed is that as long as you keep a North Star on your customer, on your everyday entrepreneurs, then ultimately the constellation of services that you provide will follow that. And I think that ultimately is the P0, the focus that should be really thinking about every day, rather than trying to optimize for an LTV calculation, trying to optimize for a CAC calculation, because those calculations, while they're very useful, very important, they tend to be lagging indicators of a business rather than forward-looking. And so the forward-looking way to operate a business and the forward way of thinking about service creation in a super app is, again, concentrating on your North Star, being very customer-focused, and being very deliberate and specific around how to serve your everyday entrepreneurs and your consumers.
And I think this question kind of ties into, I guess, Grab and what Grab directly does. But you guys are also investing in and supporting startups in Southeast Asia through Grab Ventures, right? What was that? Yeah, if you can give us some background on the initiative for that and whether there's some strategic advantage as you guys continue to grow the platform.
Sure. Well, we know that we can't do it all. We have limited time and limited resources. But what we have developed is a common platform. And if you think about some of the real gaps in infrastructure within Southeast Asia, there's one obvious gap around payments and how do you transact cashlessly for transactions across Southeast Asia. There's another gap in infrastructure around logistics, and that's where our on-demand services come in. So the Grab platform really tries to focus on solving those very core basic infrastructure gaps in the market. And hopefully then by surfacing our solutions, we can then enable a much larger, broader ecosystem of startups that are then providing differentiated services on top of what we're building. And so hopefully our goal is to support and enable other companies to provide services to consumers across Southeast Asia without having to reinvent the wheel every time that they go to market. So reinventing the payment wheel, reinventing the logistics wheel. And that's been the strategy around investing.
Thank you. So I guess just as a final thought, there's a lot of founders in this room who are building companies in Japan, but do you have any advice for them in terms of, how to be successful in startup?
First of all, I think we are on a multi-year journey, and we are very early in our own personal journey. So I would never presume to offer any advice there. But what has been truly key for us has been just focusing on a core mission, understanding your true North Star, and ultimately that will drive everything else after that.
Thank you again very much, Ming. Please give a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much.